Shake your sillies out. Are we ready? All right. Good evening and welcome to our library lecture series. My name is Sally Mason. I'm the programming manager here at the Leon County Public Library. Thank you for joining us, and we're pleased to have you to talk and have this engaging presentation on the Native peoples of the Apalachee region. The library lecture series is in its 9th year, and we've really enjoyed having these programs. They're a great opportunity to learn and engage with each other and share topics on our future and our past and connect with each other. A lot of our topics have touched on art, science, history, and culture. Tonight, we're going to view the history of the Apalachee region through the perspective of the Miccosukee tribe of Indians of Florida, tracing their journey from Lake Miccosukee to the Everglades to the big Cypress swamps. We are honored to welcome Randall Ornstein, Deputy General Counsel and Embassy Director of the Miccosukee Tribe of Indians of Florida. Mr. Ornstein also serves as the Senior Co-Chair of the American Bar Association's Indigenous Law Committee and is an enrolled member of the Southeastern Mvskoke Nation. Southeastern Mvskoke Nation, yes. His work spans legal advocacy, cultural preservation, and environmental stewardship. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Ornstein.
Thank you very
Do you
much.
like to move around or do you like to stay still?
I'll figure it out.
I have a belt mic. I'm gonna go get you.
All right.
In case you like that more.
So first of all, really appreciate y'all being here.
We can't hear back here.
How about that? All right. So he's chair Mahinwi Haboya Jahachef Kados Haso Salation So the rest of this presentation will not be in English. I'm just kidding. So my name is Everett Ornstein. Really appreciate y'all having me here, coming out to listen to me today. As was introduced, I served for the Miccosukee Tribe of Indians of Florida as the Embassy Director down on Adams Street and as Deputy General Counsel in our legal department. This has been a really awesome move for me because coming back to the Tallahassee area means coming back to where my parents live. So it's a little bit of a homecoming. So thank y'all for having me back.
Sure.
So I can't turn it up, but I can. I see people running. How about this? Okay. All right. If I'm being too loud, y'all just tell me to quiet down, okay? So, who here knows about federally recognized Native American tribes? Anybody got any context here? I see like a couple hands looking like this, a few hands up. I think we can start here by talking a little bit about the tribe and tribes generally. So this is, these are my bosses, by the way. This is Treasurer Kenny Cypress, Assistant Chairman Lucas Osceola. This might be too loud. All right. Chairman Talbert Cypress, Secretary William Osceola, and Lawmaker Pete Osceola Jr. They are the elected officials of the Miccosukee Business Council, and they serve elected terms of 4 years pursuant to the Miccosukee Constitution as organized under the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934. This is a map that I picked not because it tells you anything in particular. I just want you to see the rivers. Because when we're thinking about the geography of the Native South, we are not actually thinking about that often. The borders that you're seeing where the states are, we're more often talking about the communities that lived in these different river basins. Now, this is a picture of some Miccosukee folks in the, I think this was 1910, if it wasn't in the first decade of the 1900s. This is what folks were looking at from the 1900s. I'm showing you this photograph because we're about to dive way back into the mist of history and I don't have any photos for that. So enjoy. Also, shout out to our guests up front who are wearing what looks to be traditional Miccosukee or Seminole patchwork. And by the way, if you have some patchwork, you should wear it. I was given a patchwork jacket by an elder once, and I'm not Miccosukee, so I wasn't sure if I should wear it. He told me he'd be offended if it was sitting on my hanger for too long. So this is maybe how we can start to think about Florida. At contact with the Europeans, Florida was organized politically as similar to the ancient Mediterranean. You had city-states. You didn't have, the big sweeping nation states. We were talking like empires, we're talking city-states, And for some reason, the anthropologists like to call these tribal towns, not city-states, when they're talking about indigenous people, no reason in particular. And this region, for the most part, those tribal towns have kind of formed together into little coalitions or confederacies. And I would guess that most of the terms that y'all know to refer to Native people in the South, terms like Seminole, Creek, Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, those are the coalitions or confederacies that emerged. Some of those were in existence at contact, like the Choctaw, but some of them sort of evolved in response to European colonization. So I think it's important to understand, though, that those terms don't necessarily date back to contact in every sense. We're really looking more towards the towns, which were autonomous. Now, in this region, for those of y'all that are a little bit in the back, if you can just see the yellow that goes all the way up to the edge of the Appalachian Mountains, goes all the way down to the Keys, that was the Spanish colony of Florida as understood by the Spanish. So their claims were much broader than the Florida that y'all are familiar with today. They swept into certainly what we would today consider Georgia, some parts of Alabama. I don't even know, there might be a part of Carolina in there. But the important thing to understand is that that is the colonial experience that was first felt by the people of this region. It was not contact with British people, it was contact with Spanish people. Now, what did the Spanish do differently as they were colonizing the Americas? It's really important. They didn't really bring a whole lot of people. The English, there were large groups of colonists who had charters, Jamestown, Plymouth, that kind of thing, and they were coming as family units to settle. For the most part, when the Spanish were colonizing, they sent priests and they sent soldiers. And the goal of those priests and soldiers was to fight the folks that wouldn't submit and convert to Catholicism and become a part of the Spanish Empire. And the point of the priests was to, first accomplish the conversion process and then run what was at the time sort of known as the encomienda system. It was sort of a series of missions running across the state of Florida. And in those missions, people were still the tribal towns that they were before. They just sort of reorganized and put a church in the middle, and it became a pueblo, or it became a mission. And those societies continued to live the lives they did before, just now under Spanish colonization. And there were certainly a lot of impacts from that mission period. But I think what's really important to understand is when the Spanish came, the indigenous people were still living in Apalachee. And when the Spanish left, they left Apalachee without like a Spanish settler population. So I just want you guys to keep that in the back of your mind as we kick things off here. So speaking of really good Spanish maps, that's Florida. I know you guys are really familiar with the shape of Florida. This is Florida. But I'm gonna do my best with the Latin and pull some stuff out here. So that says Apalachee. So to the best that this map maker understands the region, Apalachee. And this says Montes Apalachii inquiris orum argentum et Eifeniunter. I don't know how to conjugate that last word, but it's basically saying the mountains of Apalachee in which are gold and silver. And then there's this little note here. in hak laku indigena argenti grana in winiut. Again, my verb conjugations are rusty, but that roughly says in this indigenous lake are found grains of silver. And so I'm just pointing this out because they're talking about a really big lake in the Apalachee province. We will return to that later. But if anyone knows the big lakes in this county, you would know that one of them is called Lake Miccosukee. I'm not spoiling the surprise. So, how are we going to jump into the Spanish period and squeeze it down into 3 minutes instead of 300 years? I think what's important is De Soto comes up, he contacts a limited number of towns. Before him was Panfilio de Narvaez. He also contacts a limited number of towns. Eventually, what the Spanish decide to do is they set up a city over here, St. Augustine, a city over here, Pensacola, and then they kind of have a road that they run through kind of the panhandle into Northeast Florida, and then they have a road that they run north. And on those roads are the missionized tribal towns. They don't really settle into those regions. There's like Dominicans and Franciscans in here, there's Jesuits, but there's not, for the most part, a lot of families. There were, of course, some colonial officials who brought their families and did reside within the Apalachee province. However, we are not talking about large-scale settlement. But what is really interesting about the mission period, to me, is when they missionize these tribal towns, they don't change their names. They just throw a saint in front. So y'all will know San Luis de Talamali or de Apalachee, depending on the era. But we can also look at a couple more of these in the Apalachee region to understand the names of the tribal towns that lived in the region. Namely, Aspalaga, Asele, I'm going to throw some things out here, Atapulcus, Aspalaga, Asele, Oxilla, Basuqua, Wasissa. I know that doesn't really sound very similar, but if you knew Spanish orthography in that period, it would make more sense. And then you got your Salcolas, there were some Salakles, your Kubaicha or Kubaica, and there were the Capaches, your Tama, the Tamatlis or Tamatlis. And so we can kind of start to understand some of the political geography of the Apalachee region just by understanding the meaning of the names of the missions. And that's very interesting. I think it's important here too to note something, which is this region, Spanish called it Tamuqua. There weren't any Tamuquas that called themselves Tamuquas, but the Spanish called this group of people Tamuquas. They did not speak the same language as this group of people. The Spanish called those Apalachees. Does anyone know what Apalachee means? Very close, yeah. So that's a little bit closer to the translation for Tallahassee, but Apalachee, it was literally just the De Soto dudes. They were walking over here, and they were like, what do you call the people over there? And the indigenous guy was like, the people over there? That's all Apalachee means. So this is also not a term that people really use to identify themselves until the Spanish taught them that they should identify themselves in that way. So that's, I think, important to understand. But as we continue, I think it's also important to understand what that culture was. Who were the Apalachee people? They spoke a language which anthropologists, linguists would call a Muskogean language family language. Let me digress here. What's a language family? It doesn't mean you can understand the other languages. A language family is like French and Romanian are in the same language family. German and English are in the same language family. So this is a language which is connected to some languages over there. Now the region where people on the ground would have understood each other would have really pushed from North Florida into South Georgia. And there were some parts over here where folks moved from there to there. They got called Yamasis, but they were moving from interior Georgia where they spoke the Lepanque language. And similarly, west of the Apalachicola in the Chickato region, folks spoke a similar enough language that Hahn and Worth would speculate that likely they were mutually intelligible. And so there's this region of, for lack of a better word, these sort of similar language is Miccosukee-ish languages, Apalachee-ish languages, if we want to get away from that term language family. Well, what do the Miccosukee call that language? They just call it our language in the Bongi. So the mission system didn't last forever, and here's why. So first of all, there's a bunch of wars going on. France was at war with Britain, Britain was at war with Spain, it was a 7 Years' War, there was a French and Indian War, there was all these different wars. And over the course of those wars, there were several naval blockades, there were disruptions to trade, but also the British started hiring some of the tribes to the north of Florida to raid down into Florida, do these slave raids, capture folks, sell them up to the Carolina colonies. This was going back and forth. A lot of the times those were people who were cousins with the people south of the Florida border, but you know, in that period, folks were looking for cash. And so the region in North Florida was gradually depopulated by a combination of disease and slave raiding, interfactional fighting, such that it was maybe the prevailing view among scholars in the middle of the last century that there were no Indians left after that. They killed them all, or they were removed to Cuba. Now, why would people think that? There's kind of 3 big reasons. One, the British said, there's this dude, Thomas Nairn, he was a British Indian nation. He leads a bunch of sort of slave raids, and he's like, we have killed every last Indian in the peninsula of Florida, such that every one of their towns is taken with people, and the last one has been killed or enslaved. So we have British dudes saying, we won, in very hyperbolic terms. There's then a Spanish dude, Lieutenant Diego Peña, and he goes through the Mission Road, goes down this road, and he stops at each of the major mission towns, and he's like, okay, that town's empty now. We must have got all the Indians. And then there's also the fact that the Spanish had these censuses, right? You had a priest who'd come through, called a visita, visitation. You go like, okay, there's this many Christians in this town. Let's go to the next one. There's this many Christians in this town, and on across the state. Now, what that misses is this fundamental phenomenon called cimarrones. Anyone know what cimarrones means in Spanish? Yeah, so it's
Untamed wild people.
yeah, untamed wild people. I'll take that one. That's a solid answer. So the word cimarrones in Spanish could have the connotation of like runaway livestock or something, but it's a cognate to our English term maroon. You know, like a maroon colony. People that are out in the woods, not living together with society. And we start having the Spanish and the indigenous leaders in the period complain a bunch about these cimarrones. One of the, actually the earliest indigenous writing was written by Don Manuel Ossole, whose town was on the Oxilla River. And he wrote a letter to the governor of Spain, or of Spanish Florida, saying, hey, I need clothes, I need food, and can you stop running all my livestock to the big lake to the north of Oxilla River? Also, all my people are fleeing to the forests. They don't like living in this mission system. You gotta work on this thing, or I'm gonna have nobody in my town by winter. It's a letter. It was written by Don Manuel Ossole. And similarly, when De Soto had first come through sort of the southern edge of the Apalachee region, the Amacano region, coming through the tribal town of Aute, his chroniclers are noting the people are going to take refuge in the Lago Grande, the big lakes, where our cavalry can't pursue them. If anybody's been to Lake Miccosukee, you would know it's shallow. It's like 4 feet deep. You can stand in it horses cannot really chase you through. And so what was happening as these Spanish mission censuses were declining in number, as the leaders of those indigenous towns were, by the way, complaining everyone was going into the forest, but then the Spanish censuses are saying, oh, there's no more Christians left in this town. They've all left, or they've all died, or they've all been raided, or something happened. It wasn't our fault. We didn't let them run away. And then Diego Pena, when he comes through, he only goes to the sites of the former missions. You have his entire journal, day by day, stop by stop, camp by camp. All he does is he goes, I have arrived at the former mission of Apalachee. It is plentiful with fruit trees, although there are no longer any inhabitants. I camped for a night, and then in the morning I progressed and I crossed the Osceola River and arrived towards Fort San Marcos the next day. That's what that account reads like. And subsequent scholars pointed to it and said, proof. No more Indians. Now, why does this matter? It matters because if the tribes of Florida aren't from Florida, they don't have rights to Florida's land. And so this was part of a propaganda effort in the 1700s and 1800s to try to divest the tribes of Florida of their heritage in Florida. This is a fun map. I like this one. So, French and Indian Wars. Y'all know the French and Indian Wars? 7 Years' War. Remember it from 7th grade. It ends in 1763 with the First Treaty of Paris. It's really this big war between, I don't know, Catholic and Protestant powers in Europe, which kind of spills over into the frontier. And the British capture Havana. Not Gadsden, but the city of Cuba. And for the Spanish, this is the most valuable city in the New World. It's their administrative hub. It's their big naval port where they've got like 3 continents, 4 continents worth of trade flowing through the port of Havana, Cuba, from Africa, from Europe, from South America, from North America. So they go, you know what? Good job, Britain. In this peace treaty, we will give you all of Florida. We really need Havana back. It was just for the port. It wasn't even for the island. So they traded the state of Florida for Havana. Now, that means we then get this early British map. The British come through, they're looking around. This actually doesn't really go that far north. Doesn't even go to the end of the St. Mark's River, I don't think. But what it does show us is the Spanish not really putting any points on the map. They have a very limited understanding of this region, which is shaped by primarily their slave raiding operations, which had taken place in the course of the French and Indian Wars. But then they do this little census at the start of the British period. And on that map that they make, not actually this map, but the other map is really crappy. It's just a bunch of lines. But they do note in 1763, when they go through the census, there's a town named Miccosukee. It's a little bit to the north of this map, but it's sitting on the banks of Lake Miccosukee. And the guy in charge is this guy named Ken Hadjo. And Ken Hadjo's in charge at the town of Miccosukee on the banks of Lake Miccosukee at the same time that King Payne is ruling in the Payne's Prairie. So probably, we don't really know, but maybe probably Ken Hadjo was like Ken Hadjo. Hadjo's sort of this Appalachian, like crazy brave, so the crazy brave king. Also, if you live in Golden Eagle, North Carolina States, there's another way to spell that name, and it's like Kenheja, Kenhajo, Kenhega. You guys got a road? Kinhega. Y'all say it differently than the tribe does, though, so I'm not going to try. Now, the British established themselves here. They start going through and identifying the leaders of towns, where they're at, who they are. They give Ken Hadjo the title of captain in the British military, and in fact, the Miccosukee do supply some couple hundred troops during the American Revolution. Florida, a loyalist colony, if anybody's tracking that in the upcoming sesquicentennial. semi-sesquicentennial. Anyway, Kinahacho had another name. The name that he was called, which was a little bit more traditional, less of sort of, he's picking an English sounding name for, sound like a king, you know? And his traditional name was the Old Capetchi Miko. Why is this significant? What's Capetchi? Most of the time when we have this formulation, Old blank Miko, that is the leader of a town which has collapsed. So who's the Old Capetchi Miko? What was Capetchi? San Damian de Capetchi was on the banks of Lake Jackson. Before the Capetchi were missionized within the Apalachee province, the Capetchi were also recorded as being in southern Georgia. The Apalachee were encountered by De Soto. And held together with some subsequent lists that we get at the end of the First Seminole War compiled by the Americans, we also find some more interesting things. Like, remember the Asfala mission? That's still there. The Apalachee didn't leave. And remember that guy kept talking about Don Manuel of Asile? Well, strangely enough, there's still an Asile tribal town on the list of the Miccosukee Seminole towns at the end of the First Seminole War. And so what we're finding is, this is honestly pretty new scholarship, there's a lot of very, very direct correlations between the names of the missions in Apalachee and the people who were there, who said they were always there, and the people who came before. They are the Cimarrones of the Apalachee province. Now to understand this region, we're getting into American history now, so let's get it. So, y'all remember what Florida looked like in that first map that was sort of a big giant triangle? This is what Florida looked like when Britain took it over. The province of East Florida went pretty far north, up to the St. Mary's River in Georgia. Obviously, it doesn't look like that now. Anyone guess why? So the British had this new country to the north they were dealing with. This thing called the United States of America. They'd had this Revolutionary War, they'd established their independence, and the United States was trying to make this thing called Georgia. And they were in the effort of getting some treaty sessions in Georgia so that they could set up that colony. And then in 1796, they were talking with the Indians up there in Alabama and Georgia, the Creeks, and they were like, hey, it would be really nice if we could push the border a little further south into Spanish Florida. There's some great red hills there. It would be really nice if we could just get some of those hills. We could, it would be very profitable for us, and we would really appreciate your assistance. And the Creek National Council heard that and was like, I don't know, I don't think we can speak for the towns down there. And actually, Apalachee, the speaker of the Creek National Council, said we cannot speak on behalf of them. They are holding at a distance. They're not coming to our councils. And so this may be a visual without the colors, but harder for you guys in the background. So I'm gonna switch back in a second. But just understanding the Seminoles, the Tallahassees, the Apalachees, that cultural region stretched north. It stretched into southern Georgia. And so in 1796, there was a missive that came with the Indian agent Benjamin Hawkins down to the tip of what we would today call Lake Seminole. Before that, it was the juncture of the Flint, Chattahoochee, and Apalachicola rivers. And he brought a bunch of surveyors. And they were like, you know what? We're going to get down there with our survey equipment. We're going to survey the new boundary of Florida. Good plan, you guys. So they reach what we would today consider the Florida region. And they go to sleep. And then all their sails get slashed and they get sent back up the river. Because it quickly becomes clear to them that the creeks, as they had indicated, did not speak on behalf of the tribes to the south. And also, by this point, the Miccosukes were getting a little uneasy with the whole thing going on, this whole power dynamic shift. Before all this, before, the Revolutionary War and stuff, the British were up here, the French were right here, the Spanish were right there. And if you're in the middle of all of that, you can kind of point that way. Don't attack me, go attack your ancient rival over there. You can walk through. Yeah, go ahead, walk through. We can't have our lands. It was actually the subject of the Cognitive Resolution of 1718. And so when you started to see that sort of tripolar political order collapse, and it happened really quickly, first, American Revolution, second, Louisiana Purchase. And then it was just Florida. And so for the Miccosukee, for the Seminole peoples who were remaining in these Cimarrones communities, the threat of pushing south this border was a big one. And so the Miccosukee-Spanish War began. You guys know about the Miccosukee-Spanish War, right? It was fought right here in your home county. 7-year long, 6-year long, depending on how you count it. All the plantations in East Florida, well, a good number of the plantations in East Florida burned down. We learned our lesson talking about all the missions being destroyed, all the villages disappearing. And in fact, the Miccosukee, with their ally, a pirate named William Augustus Bowles, they formed a 3-person directorate general. They declared a republic, and then they went to war with Spain. They captured Fort San Marcos, the only major Spanish military installation in north central Florida. And then they reached a negotiated deal with the Spanish, whereby the Spanish confirmed their ownership of those territories, but the border didn't get changed. But I think the point I'm making here is from Ken Hancho's perspective, from the perspective of the Miccosukee fighting the Miccosukee-Spanish War, they were upset that their territories were getting cut in half. The territory that they considered to be their own was like that. So South Georgia and North Florida. Anything that is the range of the Gila Bush and Choctaw, the Gila Bunkies. So, digression. But in the Creek Confederacy to the north, there was a minority of Gila Bush, not Choctaw people, not my language, Miccosukee. And they were referred to by their tribal towns, Hitchiti, Ocmulgee, the Foul Towns, etc. And so there's this civil war that started happening up there in Creek Country. Because there was a group of folks that were aligning with the United States. And then there was a group of folks that were getting some input from Tecumseh. Anyone remember some good history? Tippecanoe and Tyler too, all that jazz. So Tecumseh is sort of raising this traditionalist revolution against the folks that were aligning with the United States up in Alabama and Georgia. That becomes the Creek Civil War. It is a bloody conflict. It is fought for a couple of years and roughly patterns on as a proxy war of the War of 1812, with the United States backing the faction that was sort of taking up Western agriculture and making trade alliances with the United States. The White Sticks, the Friendly Creeks, take your pick. Those are my ancestors. And then you have the group that were fighting the United States. They took the name on of Red Sticks. This refers to a traditional myth. We're not going to go into that today. But series of battles, not really the history of this region. But what happens is the traditionalists lose. And then there's 4,000 refugees, mostly a lot of them former soldiers, not mostly, that flow south across the Florida border. And they don't come into an empty place. They find the Miccosukee. And so they start setting up in the region. Miccosukee welcomes them. And the British, although, okay, so take a step back here. European colonial boundaries. So Britain gets Spain after the First Treaty of Paris. They have it for 20 years. And then Britain loses the American Revolution. So then it swaps back from Britain to Spain, because Spain supported the United States to some degree, mostly fiscally, during the American Revolution. So then there's a second Spanish period stretching from 1783 until now. So the Spanish is the point. And the Spanish, when they come back the second time, they do like a quarter of as much as they did the first time. They don't even bring the priests back. They don't do the mission system at all. They just want St. Augustine, and they want Pensacola, and they want to trade out of those ports, and that's it. So in this period, when the Miccosukee roundly defeat the Spanish during the Miccosukee-Spanish War, they're sort of reasserting their control over this region. And the people to the north, the Creeks, they see that. And the refugees from the Creek Confederacy take refuge in this well-protected, independent region. And Jackson sees that too. So we got this guy named General Andrew Jackson. He is a general. He's also, a landowner in the South that conducted the primary industry in the South, which was plantation agriculture. And how do you get wealthy as a planter? Land. Also, he was not too happy, nor was the United States, that the Miccosukee, and this is where I was pausing on the colonial stuff. So it's Spanish now, but the British are still there. It's important to understand. It makes no sense, but it was Spanish. They didn't really set anything up, so the British were like, we're coming back in. So there's this guy, Lieutenant Colonel Edward Nichols, and he starts building fortresses. Yeah, Apalachicola River is a little off the map. He starts building fortresses up the Apalachicola in partnership with Ken Hodjo, the leader of Miccosukee. One of those fortresses, they start taking as refugees folks who had escaped from slavery in Alabama and Georgia. And the British and the Miccosukee did this cool thing where they gave them all guns and uniforms, and they became British colonial Marines. And then General Andrew Jackson's sitting there, and another year has passed since the end of the Creek Civil War. It's 1815 at this point. But now you have this growing consolidation of enemies across the border, a bunch of military-aged males who had gone south at the end of the Creek Civil War, who had almost defeated the United States. So you got to invade, right? And so he marches down first. They attack the, as they were calling it at the time, the Negro Fort. At the Negro Fort, it is sort of a tragedy of history. The attacking force, which was General Andrew Jackson, about 1,000 U.S. regulars and militia, and about 1,800 Creeks, being led by the Brigadier General of the U.S. military, William McIntosh, or Tostanigi, the warrior for the whites, who is my fifth great grandfather. But Jackson and McIntosh and their forces march on Negro Fort. They heat up a cannonball. This is something you did back in the day. Before bombs, you took a cannonball and you put it in a kettle. And you made the cannonball hot, and then you shot the cannonball. So they did that. And it hit the powder magazine in the fort. So the whole thing exploded. There's some really nasty first-person accounts of babies on top of buildings. It's a very, very brutal attack on Negro Fort. But for some reason, scholars generally don't see this as the start of the First Seminole War. I do. So that attack happens. And then there's a group up here in South Georgia called the Foul Towns, the Tutulusi Tulufobi. And the Foul Towns are led by a guy named Aneamatla. And Aneamatla, he had been in the Creek Civil War. But he spoke the same language. He spoke Ilapongi as the Miccosukee. He wasn't part of that dominant Muskogee population in the Creek Confederacy. So he was like, all right, I'm going to move farther south from near Albany down to right on the Florida border. And if anyone messes with me, my Miccosukee allies are going to protect me. Fortunately, Jackson's forces get burned down a second town. So where did he have to go after that? He went to the banks of Lake Miccosukee, where Ken Hodjo welcomed him. Ken Hodjo also welcomed Abiake of Tapananoka. and Billy of the Nagoshi. And then there were several towns around Lake Miccosukee. And this was looking very much like a war. So Jackson marches in. Kind of goes east and west and back east again. We're going to ignore all that because it's not on our map. And then he comes east and he crosses the Apalachee. And then he follows the old Spanish road down towards the Tallahassees. Tallahassees were a group that had come south from the Creek Confederacy and joined up with the Miccosukee. They'd already fled. They were hanging on the banks of Lake Miccosukee with the rest of the forces. But those are the thing that happened. This volcano in Indonesia. This volcano erupted in Indonesia in 1816. I swear this is relevant. I can hear my wife rolling her eyes right now. Because that volcano exploded, it dramatically dropped the average temperature on the world by blocking sunlight, which meant it was a very cold winter. That's the only point. It's a very cold winter. And so the Miccosukee and their allies, it started snowing in Tallahassee. None of y'all know what that's like. So when it started snowing in Tallahassee, they were like, oh, we don't fight this shit. So they went back to their towns. And Jackson sees this. So he's like, you know what we should do? We should attack them or something. So he marches on their towns while they're at camp for the winter. And they burn every house. Complete cleansing of the towns around Lake Miccosukee. Where did they go? So I got more slides. So real quickly, before we talk about Miccosukee being removed from the region, I just want to also note, besides Lake Miccosukee, there were several Miccosukee settlements throughout the region. Also their allies, like the Tamaqui, the Swakli, the Aspalaga or Apolgus or Tafalga folks. But this is actually a map of Gadsden County, and I live near it. And there are Miccosukee towns in Gadsden County as well. So this is a nation, not just one town. But then Spain signs this treaty with America. It's called the Amazonas Treaty. Spain leaves.
Back towards the podium where it's back of the stage.
Thank you, sir. And so Spain signs this treaty with America. It's called the Amazonas Treaty. Spain gives this to America. But importantly, Spain says you must honor the property rights of all residents within Florida at this time, including tribes. And so they have to do a treaty thing. So the US tries to get a treaty negotiation together. It takes almost 5 years after the first treaty gets negotiated. It's like 1819, 1824, the signatory dates. This says 1823, so maybe that's right. But I don't think it was ratified until 1824. In any case, many leaders agreed to move to a Central Florida reservation. By the time this treaty is negotiated, Ken Hodge dies. He was like in his 80s, because remember, he was there for the American Revolution. He was old. And the guy who was calling the shots, there were a couple different people who were trying to call the shots. This one guy named Aneamata, we just talked about him, came south from Georgia. He got in an argument with Governor Duval. If anybody knows the whole Elcott story, there were some surveyors, they like magically found Tallahassee because one walked from Pensacola, one walked from St. Augustine, and they met in the middle. They did already know the region, they already had maps, they knew what the state of Florida was. They didn't just pop up there. But they met an Indian dude. You guys know that story. And he said something like, if you try to build stuff here, the streets will run red with blood. That guy, that was a Neamatma. And so Governor Duval kind of gets pissed at him because of this. So he shows up with 300 troops during a tribal council meeting, and he deposes him, which is not a thing he did. But Duval did it anyways. And Neamatma really just lost face with the community and had to flee north. There was another gentleman, Tiger Tail. He was a friend of Governor Duval's, also Miccosukee. Tiger Tail actually taught Governor Duval how to whittle, how to do woodworking, or his son, actually. So you can see that, like, the log cabin that the Tallahassee Historical Society built. Yeah? Now imagine Tigertail was sitting on the steps of that cabin teaching Governor Duval's son how to whittle. There were a lot of different realities in this period between the First and Second Seminole War. There was also the folks under John Hicks, or the Goshiamakla, and Uchibili. And they were a little bit more inclined to negotiate with the United States. And they then started making their way down towards this area after first setting up for a little bit up towards Madison County. If y'all know where the Hickstown swamp is, this is that Hicks. So they make it down onto this reservation. And then Abiake, who I mentioned earlier, he's like, I don't trust any of these people. So he goes down to the Miami River in Everglades, and he sets up, before this treaty even gets negotiated, he's salvaging ships that are shipwrecking in the Biscayne Bay. How do we know this? Because one time, a group of American sailors was captured. And he was apparently doing a test. He was saying, what language do all of you speak? And if you spoke French or you spoke Spanish, he'd let you free. But if you spoke English, especially with an American accent, so there was this one American private that faked like he could speak French. And so that's how we know where Abiake was and what he was up to in this period of time. Abiake also went with a group of leaders to the Bahamas to seek the support of Governor Dunmore, the former royal governor of Virginia, now governor of Bahamas. While the British did not agree to provide troop support, they did provide, a little vessel to get him back, plus quite a bit of money. Thanks, twice. We're going to speed up here. Towards the end, now we're moving time for questions. Fairly. Second Seminole War, the bloodiest, costliest Indian war in U.S. history. 12 years with the troops in the building. But had the highest rate of junior officer resignation of any war fought in U.S. history. Higher than the U.S. Civil War, higher than Vietnam, higher than Korea. This was a brutal war. It saw the population of Miccosukee and Seminoles start somewhere in the tens of thousands and end at about 200. They built a concentration camp. I got a Jewish last name, I can say that. They built a concentration camp up near the Tampa Bay area where they would remove everybody from the rest of the state, they would concentrate them in the camp, and then they would take them out to Oklahoma. Abiake and Tigertail got intentionally captured a couple times, and they kept jailbreaking people out of there, so they had to move that over to Egmont Key. But actually, Hitler in 1941, in an address in Nuremberg, said, "Let the Volga be our Mississippi River, and let us send the inferior races east of that river so that we can have the living room to survive as a people." So he was actually explicitly looking back to this period for his inspiration. Now, remember there were tribal towns. Seminole, some sort of a coalition, confederacy. Miccosukee is one of those towns. There's other towns. We talked a little bit about the folks out in Payne's Prairie. Those were the Apalachee Seminole folks. And there were like somewhere around 20-ish towns. By the end of the Second Seminole War, by a combination of bribery and capture, this is not military history, you're not skipping ahead, all but 3 towns had been removed to Oklahoma. There were 3 left. One was led by Abiake, that was the Miccosukee. One was led by Old Tallahassee Miko, that was the Tallahassees, they were by Okeechobee. And one was led by Billy Bowlegs, that was the Oconee Seminoles. And Billy Bowlegs, there's a truce, right? Truce happens in 1838. Sort of reserves all of Southwest Florida for Indian people up the Shark River, west on the Caloosahatchee, and south, or west on the Peace River, and south. Now they make that deal, but Abiake had just gotten a group of Spanish Indians, people who had been actually taken by the Spanish, converted, taken to Cuba, but were sort of living this itinerant life back and forth between Cuba and the Keys in South Florida, where they were fishing seasonally. Those were called Spanish Indians. A lot of them were Calusa or Cuesta folks. Abiake recruited about 200 of them and then tried to make a truce. But their lands were just to the east of the truce line. So they got very unhappy And a group led by Chiquita went and burned down U.S. Southern Command, which was at the time either on plantation here, Tavernier Key. I don't really know the keys very well, but it was on a key. He burned it down. The U.S. chased him down on him and all the leaders of the Spanish Indians, and the remnant of that group merged in with the Miccosukee. And then they redo the truce again, same rules. It was 1842. We go into 1843. In Florida now, getting statehood. It's getting there. And it's pissed, because like, wait, there's still Indians down there. I thought we were supposed to get rid of the Indians. So in 1843, the Florida legislature passes the Florida Armed Occupation Act. You can stake out 5 acres, but you can shoot any of the Indians there. At the end of 5 years, you get 160 acres to be your homestead. That opened up the state of Florida for settlement. So, some geography. First Seminole War, they kicked everyone out that was west of the Swanee. Second Seminole War, they kicked everyone into the southwestern corner. And then in between the second and the third, they did this Florida Armed Occupation Act thing, right? I'm checking. So the Secretary of War at the time was this gentleman named Jefferson Davis. Y'all have never heard of him. Not a part of Southern history textbooks at all. And this gentleman named Jefferson Davis, who was the Secretary of War, one of those again, he was wanting more. That's what you do. So he's looking at these truce lines and he's like, I don't like those. I don't mean scooch them in. Just so we kept having surveyors go out and kind of scooch the lines, just resurvey the lines. Oh, I think they're wrong. Gotta resurvey them again. Remember, there's no GPS back then, so kind of whoever's word, right? So one starts hacking his way through Billy Bowlight's banana field. He did not exit the banana field. So began the Third Seminole War. Billy Bowlight's was captured. He was taken out to New Orleans and eventually out to Oklahoma. His band collapsed into the Miccosukee and the Seminole. At this point, there's really just 2 bands left, the Miccosukee and the Tallahassees. The Miccosukee speak Opongi. The Tallahassees are renegades that fought against the Creeks, but who are ethnically Creek and speak Muskogee. And the Third Seminole War was pretty uneventful because there were about 30 to 40 soldiers on the Indigenous side. There were 8,000 U.S. troops, which were active on duty on the field in the Third Seminole War. They didn't do a whole lot. They were chasing down 30 or 40 people in the middle of the swamp. Eventually, Colonel Gustavus Loomis writes to Secretary Davis, and he says, you know, I think there's 16 soldiers in this band. I think there's 17 soldiers in that band. Can we declare victory? So they do. They declare victory and they leave. Notably, though, this is actually the first war that the United States does not accomplish its stated objectives in the war. Sometimes call that not a victory. Third Seminole War ends. Anyone know what happens in the year after the Third Seminole War ends in 1858? Anything happen? 1959, 1859, 1860? Yeah. Civil Wars. So all the troops, which have been in Florida for like 4 decades fighting the 3 Seminole Wars, pretty much evaporate overnight. You know, like Florida's not really in front of the Civil War. There's a sort of Union naval blockade. Folks are trying to rally around Cedar Key. There's the Battle of Electoral Bridge, which happens up near Tallahassee. But by and large, most of the troops, and we're talking there are 8,000 troops in the Third Seminole War, those aren't there anymore, to the north. Apalachee makes it a tradition of a bunch of leaders living until they're really old and being really effective as really old leaders. At this point, he's in his 80s or 90s, same as the last time. And both the Union and Confederacy approach him. And they say, you guys are like mystical swamp warriors. You beat us like 20 to 1. You join our army. And in both cases, Apalachee agreed to supply food to both sides in exchange for both sides lifting their arms embargo. And so the Miccosukee and Seminole got their guns back. Then the Civil War ended. Then no one really up to anything in their region. So the Miccosukee and Seminole had several decades to kind of set back up. And you kind of see on this map, there's a bunch of dots. If you understand the Everglades, it's sort of a bunch of tree islands. And those tree islands, people farmed and set up camps on. That's where they escaped from the soldiers. So here's where we get pretty pictures. Pretty picture. So this is early 19 teens. This is in that period before the drainage of the Everglades. That's coming next. Some folks pulling canoes, some folks carrying grain, some folks in a traditional camp. And then this. Does anyone know what this is? We're getting to the end here. This is the Central and Southern Florida Project. It is 2,175 miles of berms, dikes, and levees, 2,130 miles of canals. At last count, they're building more. This was done to make South Florida settleable, farmable. You know, the Everglades, as a sheet of flowing water, used to go from one coast to the other. It was the world's widest river, 110 miles wide. Now, as you start to chop up the system and build all these levees and dikes, the system stops flowing. It's no longer a flowing river. It's no longer the river of grass. There was a big highway built through the middle of it, taking a trail. And soon, Miccosukee subsistence practices, Seminole subsistence practices were really hard to continue. The wading birds were caught. The fish were vanishing. The deer, they were drowning in the high waters. It's going to get to like the 1950s or so. And then the US government, they're getting out of World War II, they're feeling a little broke. World War II, famously not a war. So they're going to go cut some stuff on the budget to balance the budget. They're like, you know what we need to cut? We need to cut tribes. No more tribes. So they start picking some tribes to cut first. So they decide they're going to terminate, that's the terminology they use, terminate tribes of Florida. So Seminole reaches out, they negotiate with the United States government, and they're re-recognized 3 years later in 1957. Miccosukee, if you've noticed throughout this process, never really liked signing agreements. And so Miccosukee, rather than making concessions that would involve moving up to reservations, they instead kill 4 deer. And they skin 4 deer, and they write 4 buckskin declarations on their hides. This is an old tradition. They send one to Dwight Eisenhower. They say, honor your treaties. They send one to Queen Elizabeth, saying, honor your treaties. Mr. Dwight did not reply. Queen Elizabeth did, because she was polite. Then he has another 2 left. So they take one, and they send it to the King and Queen of Spain, who are very politically astute. They responded like 10 years later and invited the Miccosukee. They didn't do anything about it at the time. There's a great picture of the King and Queen of Spain meeting with the Miccosukee leadership, though. So they set their fourth. Where are they going to send it? They figured the crown colony of Spain was this thing called Cuba. Cuba popped up once or twice in the story. So they send a Buckskin Declaration, 1959. So the thing had just happened in Cuba. This guy named Fidel Castro had taken power 6 months prior. So he gets this Buckskin Declaration. He's like, wait, you're telling me the people that live where all the nuclear missiles pointed at my country are seeking my support in international politics? Please come to Cuba. So the Miccosukee do send a delegation to Cuba. They meet with Fidel Castro. They meet with Che Guevara for about a week. And at the end of that week, the Cubans recognize the Miccosukee as a sovereign nation with control over the lands in South Florida and an ally of Cuba. And the Miccosukee go back. They won the war, right? So they get a call of concern from the White House. And 3 years later, Eisenhower goes out, Kennedy comes in. There's a lot of politics on the process. And what happens is the Miccosukee agree to cut off all communications with Cuba. All the people that went to Cuba, they're banned from the White House. But they'll be a federally recognized tribe just like the Seminoles. So we got their parity. And then the federal government was like, great, we got that done. So here's your reservation. And the Miccosukee said, you know what? I seem to remember that y'all made a deal with me for all the land in Southwest Florida. So the Miccosukee said, how about that? We would rather have all the land in Southwest Florida. And so 20 years later, because if there's one thing you learn in this story, Miccosukee has a good memory. Years later, federal government and the state government finally compromise, and they quadruple the lands that they were going to confirm to the Miccosukee from, 70,000 acres and all the work. It's the part where they're dumping all the dirty water from the agricultural fields to the north. They then expanded it, went from just that to also this. And then the Miccosukees decided to forcibly resettle Everglades National Park, where they'd been evicted from. And they got another 600 acres. And then someone tried to build this really big airport in the middle of the big Cypress. And everyone knew that was a really bad idea because it's a really fragile ecosystem. And any further development at that site, so said the biologists at the time, would have catastrophic environmental consequences. And so the development on that airport was stopped, leaving one tarmac in the middle of Big Cypress Free Plant. And in its place, the Big Cypress National Preserve was created, some 750,000 acres, all of which the Miccosukee had continuing use and occupancy rights in. So from an offer of 70,000 acres, the Miccosukee, by the end of the century, had fought for rights to live, hunt, fish, and about 1.2 million too. That's a pretty good record. And so these are the lands roughly today that the Miccosukee inhabit. You have the Big Cypress National Preserve, the red or some Miccosukee reservations or lands. Yellow is Seminole because it's relevant for y'all to see. The graduation of the Miccosukee Indian School today, the Miccosukee have some 600 or so members along the Tamiami Trail, spread across 22 traditional camps, as well as the Miccosukee Reserved Area. It hosts the Miccosukee Indian School, the Miccosukee Police Department, the Miccosukee Environmental Protection Agency, and many other departments. There's like 60 something. I don't know the names of them, but it is effectively a small state-ish. There's a lot of programs where there's like treatment as a state under the EPA and a few other agencies. And we get back to our tribal council elected today. So that's your 500 years of history from a Miccosukee perspective of the indigenous peoples of Apalachee. I'm over time, but if you guys want to do 1 or 2 questions, I can do 1 or 2 questions. If you guys are okay. There's an elder named Michael Frank, and he wears a hat with the Miccosukee colors on it: red, yellow, black, and white. And the white's on the top. And he says, as long as the white bar is on the top of our flag, we are at peace. You'll know you need to worry when I flip the band on my hat. Any other questions?
Here in the town.
The Miccosukee community is a community that was established after the Miccosukee were removed from this region. And so it's owned by private landholders up in that region. There's also something else with the Miccosukee name. It's there's like an agricultural co-op that's owned cooperatively by the members of the co-op. If you're talking about the lake itself, that's owned by the state. So Miccosukee does not have land ownership in this region, with the exception of the Miccosukee Embassy on Adams Street, which is where I live. Any other questions?
I've heard the Fourth Creek band that's the last floor up in Alabama. Do they have a relationship with Mississippi?
Pass. Any other questions? If you remember though, there were some wars, they did great.
How do you say the Indians off the Miami River downtown?
Oh, yeah. So the group of Indians that was on the Miami River downtown, off 27th Ave, roughly, that was the Moose Isle Village. That was actually a group that had developed on a tribal member's land. It was later, I think, acquired by some white folks, and they were sort of doing a tourist ticketed admission kind of thing. And that kind of went until the guy who had bought it decided he could flip it for something better. Real estate prices in that area of Miami famously went up. But notably, this gentleman on the left, the elder on council, Lake Miccosukee Jr., was actually born in the Missile camp, I think in the 30s or 40s out on the Miami River. So, yeah.
So you've given out a lot of information very quickly. What are recommended reading?
I will try my best to prepare for this question. I have no recommended readings. Here's why. There's readings, but I'm not going to recommend them. Because when we're talking about Indigenous history, most of those published sources are from the perspective of the US military, the Spanish military, or of the colonial governors in that period of time. It is hard to read those sources without an understanding of the cultural context that existed at that time. It's like if you were trying to read Chinese history and I gave you a recommendation for like a great book on, the collectivization and Great Leap Forward, and you're like, great, and you read it, and you're like, what happened before that? What happened after that? What's the context? And did I just read propaganda? None. So there's some good scholars, Han, Han, Worth, some of your tops for this region of Florida, particularly in the Mission period of history. Sturtevant, Covington, some good names for the period that came right after. Swanton also had a huge impact. This is what I'm talking about, guys. Swanton, like the #1 source that every other source refers back to. And he based almost all his reports on the letters going back and forth between the Indian Affairs Commissioner and like the generals in the army. So he was getting a very specific limited perspective. And so we are in the process of working on some historical scholarship that we can share with the broader community. In the meantime, I recommend that you read scholarship which has come out in the last 10 to 20 years, or scholarship which is like contemporary to the period when stuff was happening. There was a period in between, a little murky. But I think Josh Piker with Husky has some really good perspectives on like the ethnography of the era. There's a lot of people doing some really good stuff. Even a local historian around who does some research, some writing that you can find. So Andrew Frank, FSU, Dr. Andrew Frank, he's done some scholarship on the area too. A lot of this you'll find on JSTOR though. So get an academic journal account or find a couple of these sort of solid, dependable texts from the last 20 years. I'm gonna go all the way to the back. I'm gonna go you right in front, right after. Sir.
That first like pour money into so that we can get knowledge like this recorded in DVD format or something that we can subscribe to.
That's a difficult question. That requires a content creating system, which we don't have. He was asking if there's a way that we can invest to like do some DVD recordings and stuff of this, or where you could put resources to make this kind of information more available. That's again a difficult question to answer. What I would generally say though is Tallahassee Historical Society's around, back of the room, they do some work. Gadsden, West Gadsden Historical Society, Abandoned Historical Society. There's folks doing the scholarship in your local community. But that's not really a great fit. So I will say, you can go on JSTOR, JSTOR.org. That's where the academic journals are. They've made that free if you download less than 100 articles a month since COVID. It's a really good source to be able to read this content, although I don't know about these.
I believe it's the Miccosukee that have some property downtown. Is there intent to establish an embassy or do something fun like that?
So the Miccosukee are the one on Adams Street. The one you may be thinking of off of Monroe is Seminole.
Oh,
So I have no commentary on their place for that property.
that's fine.
Well, the Miccosukee Embassy is open and I'm there.
And where is that? That's on Adams?
So about a block from the governor's mansion on the Highlands.
Okay.
Right across from Associated Industries supported.
Okay.
Mhm.
You had mentioned that there's a lot of recent publications of this. What is the historiography like when you're studying this stuff? How do you go about interpreting the true history of the Miccosukee historiography that's not there?
So I have a secret weapon. It's called elders.
Yeah.
So I do have the benefit of being in the historical working group of the Miccosukee Tribe of Indians of Florida, where we collect all of the important elder perspectives, and they help us sort through these documentary histories. And there's stuff that might not pop out to us as important, and they're like, wait, no, that's it. You know? There's this very important stuff. There's, for example, this traditional story where, this is a little bit far field, but just in 30 seconds. The Miccosukee had met these folks that were white-skinned, and those folks told them that if they kept their language and culture, they were leaving, they would come back, and they would return the lands to the Miccosukee. We've been able to connect this story to a series of colonial officials that were coming around in the period when one of these empires was leaving the state of Florida, making these promises connected to the Treaty of Ghent, which closed out War 1812. And so we can kind of start to take some of those stories and say, okay, so this is what was happening. And what's usually the case is all this stuff is in the histories as we're explaining it. There's just multiple conflicting accounts. So which account do you follow? And the one that we follow is the one that the elders say is right, and that we have subsequently vetted to ensure that it doesn't conflict with other scholarship that appears accurate. And when it does, we've done our best to read the sources together to try to see what can come out of that exegesis.
You thought about writing anything yourself, or have you already on the scholarship you're working?
I am collaborating with the Miccosukee Historical Working Group under the leadership of Secretary William Osceola, who is directing the production of some forthcoming manuscript-length scholarship. Okay. I think I've hit my time.
Again, thank you so much. Thank you so much for sharing this. Very important. Before you go, I would like to invite you all to come back on Friday at 10:30 in the morning for us to unveil the second floor renovation. We're going to open that up at 10:30 on Friday. As always, if you don't have a library card, we're happy to help you get a library card. And if you liked the program tonight, if you want to give us feedback, we'd love to hear from you. It helps us build better programs for everybody. We have surveys up at the front here and on the side. We'd love to hear from you.